The first breath was a shard of glass in her lungs. Anwe pressed a gloved hand to her chest, the fine wool a pathetic shield against the mountain's brutal indifference. Each step was a bargain with the snow, which tried to steal her boots, her balance, her resolve. Below, the world she had fled was a miniature of sharp roofs and tamed fields, a place of suffocating order. Up here, there was only the vast, howling sovereignty of the wilderness. This was freedom, and it tasted of blood and ice. She had thought the cage was a room, with its gilded wallpaper and windows that looked out onto a future she had not chosen. She had been wrong. The cage was a promise, a transaction sealed by her uncle's trembling hand and the predatory smile of a man named Alistair Finch. "A perfect union," Alistair had declared, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards of her uncle's study. "Will bring a touch of the exotic to my holdings, a testament to my reach." Her uncle, a man hollowed out by debt and fear, had simply nodded, his eyes refusing to meet hers. He saw the deed for what it was, a sale. This meant she was property. This meant her body was a commodity, her life a line item in a ledger. In the oppressive heat of that room, with the scent of whiskey and expensive cigars thick in the air, Anwe had made a vow. It was not spoken. It was a hardening in her bones, a quiet fire that began to burn behind her eyes. She would not be his asset. She would not be a testament to any man's power but her own. She would not be broken. She would simply disappear. Now the memory of that suffocating warmth was a mockery as the wind tore at her light blue prairie dress, a garment chosen for its unassuming appearance, now a flag of pitiful defiance against the elements. Freedom was not a gentle release. It was a violent expulsion into a harsher, more honest form of captivity, the captivity of survival. A sound cut through the wind's moan, thin and sharp. It was not the cry of a wolf. It was the baying of hounds, a sound bred and trained for pursuit. Alistair was a man who did not suffer the loss of his acquisitions. The hunt had begun. The escape had been a thing of ghosts and shadows. Anwe moved through her uncle's house like a phantom, her soft-soled slippers making no sound on the polished floors. She took only what she could carry, a small satchel with a loaf of bread, a block of hard cheese, a flask of water, a compass, and her mother's last gift, a small, sharp knife meant for peeling fruit, now her only weapon. Every creak of the house was a shout, every shadow a potential discovery. She passed her uncle's room, the door slightly ajar. She could hear his snoring, a thick, rattling sound, the sleep of a man who had sold his conscience for a night's peace. There was no anger left in her, only a profound and chilling pity. He was a prisoner in a cage of his own making, one he would never have the courage to leave. The front door latch was the loudest sound in the world, a metallic click that seemed to echo across the entire valley. She held her breath, waiting for the shout, the sound of running feet. Nothing. Only the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the seconds of her old life. Outside, the cold was a physical blow. The moon was a sliver of bone in the black sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard. This was the moment of no return. She slipped through the side gate, a whisper of movement, and did not look back. To look back was to invite doubt, and doubt was a luxury she could not afford. For the first few hours, her flight was fueled by adrenaline. She followed the faint deer trail that wound its way up into the foothills, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The air was thin and sharp, and the silence of the forest was a stark contrast to the oppressive quiet of Alistair's presence. Here the silence was alive, filled with the rustle of unseen things, the sigh of wind in the pines. It was a silence that did not judge. It simply was. But as the adrenaline faded, the reality of her situation settled in. The mountain loomed, a jagged wall of rock and snow. It was not a sanctuary, it was a trial. As dawn threatened to break, painting the eastern sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, she paused to catch her breath. And that's when she saw them, far below. 2 pinpricks of light, lanterns moving steadily along the path she had just taken. They were not wandering, they were tracking. For freedom was quickly becoming a race for freedom, was quickly becoming a race she was destined to lose. The days bled into a miserable frozen montage. The initial terror of the lanterns faded as she pushed deeper into the high country, but it was replaced by a more insidious enemy, the mountain itself. The sun was a distant, mocking disk that offered no warmth, and the wind was a constant physical pressure, seeking out every gap in her clothing. The bread was gone in 2 days. The cheese lasted 3. Soon her diet consisted of a few handfuls of snow and the bitter, woody pine nuts she managed to pry from their cones with numb fingers. Fear, hunger, cold. They became her constant companions, a trinity of misery that gnawed at her resolve. Her light blue dress, once a symbol of her escape, was now a tattered, frozen liability, its color a beacon against the endless white. Her hands, once soft and manicured for a life of quiet uselessness, were now raw, chapped, and bleeding from scrabbling at rock and ice. She thought of Alistair's hands, pale and smooth, adorned with a heavy gold ring. Hands that had never known a day of real work, hands that only knew how to take. The thought was a spur, driving her forward when her body screamed for rest. She would not let those hands reclaim her. She would rather be claimed by the mountain, her bones scattered and bleached by the sun. But the mountain was a patient and thorough antagonist. One afternoon, as she was traversing a steep, snow-laden slope, the world beneath her feet shifted with a low, guttural groan. A web of cracks spread from her boot. Panic seized her. She tried to scramble back, but it was too late. The entire shelf of snow fractured and gave way. It was not a thunderous avalanche, but a swift, silent slide. She was swept down the slope in a rush of white, tumbling end over end, the sky and snow a dizzying blur. Her satchel, containing her compass and the precious knife, was torn from her grasp. She landed in a deep drift at the bottom of a ravine with a jarring impact that drove the air from her lungs. For a moment she lay there, buried to her waist, gasping. When she tried to push herself up, a bolt of white-hot agony shot from her left ankle. She looked down. It was twisted at an unnatural angle. The sound that escaped her lips was not a scream, but a thin, broken sob. The loss was absolute. No food, no direction, no way to walk. The hunters behind her were no longer the primary threat. She was alone, crippled, and the sun was beginning to set. The mountain had finally cornered her. Loss had a color. It was the deep, encroaching purple of the shadows that filled the ravine as dusk fell. Despair was a physical weight pressing down on her chest, making each breath a monumental effort. She had dragged herself a few feet to the meager shelter of a rock overhang, but it was a futile gesture. The cold was sinking into her bones, a deep, final chill that promised a sleep from which she would not wake. Her ankle throbbed with a relentless, sickening pulse. This was it, then, the end of her defiance. She had traded a gilded cage for a tomb of ice. A bitter irony, she thought, her mind growing sluggish. She had fought so hard for sovereignty, only to be utterly conquered by a force that didn't even know her name. She closed her eyes, the image of her mother's face a fleeting warmth in the frozen landscape of her mind. She tried to hold on to it, but it slipped away, replaced by the encroaching darkness. Then a scent, faint, almost imagined, but undeniable. Smoke. Not the wild, acrid smell of a forest fire, but the controlled, resinous scent of burning pine. Her eyes snapped open. Hope was a dangerous, treacherous thing, but it was also a reflex. Through a gap in the rocks she saw it, a thin, steady plume of gray smoke rising against the darkening sky, no more than a few 100 yards away. A person. It could be anyone, a trapper, a prospector, or it could be Alistair's men closing their net. The choice was stark, certain death here, or a chance, however slim, with the unknown. The instinct to survive, battered and nearly extinguished, flared one last time. She began to crawl. Every movement was an exercise in agony. She used her elbows and her good leg, dragging her useless one behind her, leaving a pathetic trail in the snow. The few 100 yards felt like 1,000 miles. The smoke grew stronger, guiding her. Finally, she peered over a snow-covered log. There was a small, crackling fire, and a man. He was a silhouette against the flames, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy, dark coat. A rifle leaned against a nearby pack. It was still, watchful, and utterly. It was still, watchful, and utterly unreadable. He made no move toward his weapon. He simply sat there, by his fire, watching the broken thing in the tattered blue dress that had crawled out of the darkness. Captivity had found her again, but this time it had a human face, etched by firelight and shadow. He did not speak. For a long time the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and Anway's own ragged breathing. She remained half hidden behind the log, her body trembling uncontrollably from cold and pain. The man, this silent gunslinger, finally made a move. It was slow, deliberate. He reached for a tin cup near the fire, poured something steaming from a pot, and placed it on the snow a few feet in front of him. A clear, simple invitation. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her. He was a stranger, a man with a rifle in the middle of nowhere, but the aroma of hot, bitter coffee reached her, and the promise of its warmth was a siren call. Slowly, painfully, she dragged herself the final few feet into the circle of firelight. He watched her, his eyes missing nothing. The torn dress, the raw hands, the grotesquely swollen ankle. His face was weathered, carved by wind and sun, with a thick, dark beard that hid his mouth. But his eyes were clear, a startling gray, and they held no malice, only a kind of weary assessment. When she was settled, wincing as she tried to find a position that didn't send waves of fire up her leg, he finally spoke. His voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together. "You'll lose the foot if it stays like that." He gestured with his chin toward her ankle. He stood, retrieved a small canvas roll from his pack, and knelt in the snow beside her. He worked with a surprising gentleness, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft. He cut away the frozen fabric of her boot and stocking with a sharp knife. Anway flinched but held herself still. This was a new kind of bargain, her survival in exchange for trust she did not have. He examined the injury, his touch firm but not rough. "It's not broken clean, but it's bad." He took 2 flat pieces of wood from his pack and tore strips from a clean cloth. He worked silently, efficiently, binding her ankle into a crude but effective splint. The pain was immense, but the stability was an instant relief. He gave her the cup of coffee, and she took it with trembling hands, the heat seeping into her fingers. He then offered her a piece of dried meat, tough and salty. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. He didn't ask her name, or where she came from, or why she was alone and broken on his mountain. He seemed to accept her presence as he accepted the snow and the stars, another feature of the landscape. As she ate, he cleaned his knife and put away his supplies. "Rest," he said, the single word a command. He added more wood to the fire and settled back on the other side, wrapping himself in his bedroll. He had taken her in, tended to her, fed her. He had also made her his prisoner. She was trapped not by bars, but by her own broken body and her complete dependence on this grim, silent stranger. Days settled into a strange, quiet routine. The man, who she learned was named Cassian, was a creature of habit and few words. He would rise before dawn, check the snares he had set, and then hunt. He would leave her with a small pile of firewood and a portion of food before disappearing into the trees, his rifle a natural extension of his arm. Anway, confined to the small campsite, began to heal. The swelling in her ankle slowly went down, the sharp agony dulling to a persistent, heavy ache. In the long hours of his absence, she fought off the despair that threatened to consume her. She was still a captive, her fate entirely in his hands. He had saved her life, but for what purpose? Was he waiting for her to heal only to sell her to the highest bidder? Was he one of Alistair's men, playing a long and cruel game? The questions circled in her mind like vultures. To combat the idleness, she made herself useful. She had watched her mother sew, and the muscle memory remained. Using the small kit from Cassian's pack, she began to mend the tears in his clothes, her stitches small and neat. She learned to bank the fire so it wouldn't die out, to brew the bitter coffee just the way he seemed to like it. These small acts were a way of paying a debt, but they were also a way of reclaiming a piece of herself. Her hands were no longer useless ornaments. They were tools. One evening, he returned with a brace of rabbits and found her stitching a patch onto his worn coat. He stopped and watched her for a moment, his gray eyes unreadable in the firelight. He didn't thank her, but he placed one of the rabbits near her. "Skin it," he said. It wasn't a request. She had never done such a thing, and her stomach turned at the thought, but she saw the challenge in his eyes, the silent test. She took the knife he offered, its weight unfamiliar in her hand. Her first attempt was a clumsy, bloody mess, but she persisted, her jaw set in determination. She would not show weakness, not to him. Later, as they sat by the fire eating the roasted meat, the silence between them felt different. It was less a void and more a shared space. He looked at her tattered blue dress, a faint line appearing between his brows. "We'll need to get you warmer clothes," he said, more to himself than to her. It was the first time he had spoken of a future, a we that included her. It sent a strange, unsettling flutter through her chest. Was it hope? Or just the prelude to a different kind of transaction? The thaw between them was as slow and imperceptible as the melting of a glacier. It did not happen with grand gestures or long conversations, but in the small, shared rituals of survival. He started leaving her his whetstone, a silent invitation for her to sharpen the camp knives. She learned the rhythm of his movements, the way he would pause and listen to the forest before taking a step. He, in turn, began to talk, not about himself, but about the world around them. He taught her the names of the stars they watched wheel across the night sky, the tracks of the animals that passed their camp, the signs of a coming storm. He never asked about her past, and she never offered it. It was a silent pact between them, a recognition that they were both fugitives from a world that had left them scarred. One night, a blizzard descended upon them without warning, a furious wall of wind and blinding snow. Their small shelter was no match for its power. A gust of wind tore a large branch from an old pine, sending it crashing down, scattering their fire and collapsing part of their lean-to. Cassian moved instantly, shoving her behind the relative safety of a large boulder, just as the branch fell where she had been sitting. For a moment they were plunged into darkness and chaos. When the wind momentarily died down, he was already working, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Stay there!" he yelled over the howl of the storm. He fought against the wind, securing their supplies, rebuilding a semblance of shelter. Anway, her heart pounding, refused to be a helpless burden. She crawled out, her splinted ankle protesting, and began gathering the scattered, glowing embers, cupping them in a piece of bark, shielding them from the snow. She brought them to him, a tiny offering of fire against the overwhelming cold. He looked at her, his face stark in the faint glow, and for the first time she saw something other than weary competence in his eyes. It was respect. Together they worked through the night, a silent, efficient team, fighting to keep the storm at bay. By dawn the blizzard had passed, leaving the world pristine and silent, buried under a thick blanket of new snow. They were exhausted, cold, but alive. He sank down by the newly rebuilt fire, his shoulders slumped. She knelt beside him, taking a clean strip of cloth and gently wiping a smear of soot from his cheek. Her fingers brushed against his rough beard. He didn't move. He just watched her, his gray eyes intense. "You did good, Anway," he said, using her name for the very first time. The sound of it in his low voice was a revelation. It anchored her, made her real. He leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. His lips were chapped and cold, but the kiss was a spark of impossible warmth in the frozen world. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition. Two survivors, finding a fragile harbor in each other. The kiss changed the landscape between them. The silence that followed was no longer one of caution, but of shared intimacy. They moved around the camp with a new awareness of each other, a quiet energy humming in the space they occupied. He would watch her as she worked, a small, almost imperceptible softening around his eyes. She found herself listening for the sound of his return each day, her heart giving a small, traitorous leap when he emerged from the trees. The physical boundary between them had dissolved. Their bedrolls were now placed side by side, a silent acknowledgment of the shift. He taught her how to set a snare, his large hands guiding hers, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her. She learned that his gruff exterior was a fortress built around a core of profound loss. He spoke of his wife and son, not with maudlin sentiment, but with a raw, factual grief that was more moving than any tears. They had been killed by raiders while he was away, a fact he had carried like a shroud for years. Anway, in turn, found the words to tell him of Alistair, of the gilded cage and the transaction she had fled. She spoke of her uncle not with anger, but with a sad understanding of his weakness. Cassian listened without interruption, his jaw tight, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. "He won't stop looking," he said when she had finished. "Men like that see people as possessions. An insult to their pride is worse than a debt." The words sent a chill through her, a reminder that the world beyond their mountain sanctuary was still waiting. But the fear was different now. A full moon bathed the snow in ethereal light. He took her hand. His palm was rough against hers, a map of a hard-lived life. "My wife," he began, his voice low. "She loved the moon. Said it was the world's lantern, showing lost people the way home." He looked at Anway, his gaze direct and heavy with unspoken meaning. "Maybe it's not about finding the old home. Maybe it's about finding a new one." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture of such unexpected tenderness it made her breath catch. He then gently kissed her lips, a longer, deeper kiss than the first. It was a promise, not of safety, but of solidarity, a vow that whatever came for them, they would face it together. In his arms, under the silent watch of the moon, Anway felt a sense of belonging she had never known, a fragile peace earned through fire and ice. Their mountain idyll was shattered by the crack of a rifle shot that was not Cassian's. It echoed through the valley, sharp and predatory. They both froze, the sound an immediate violation of their sanctuary. Cassian's hand went to his pistol, his body instantly coiled with tension. "Raiders," he said, his voice a low growl. "Get behind the rocks. Stay down." Another shot rang out, closer this time, followed by a man's triumphant yell. These were not trackers like Alistair's men. This was random, brutal violence, the kind that had taken Cassian's family. Fear, cold and familiar, tried to grip Anwe, but something else rose to meet it, a fierce, protective anger. This was her home now. These men were trespassers. Cassian moved with fluid lethality, melting into the shadows of the trees at the edge of their camp. Anwe scrambled behind the boulder fall as instructed, her heart hammering. But she did not cower. She watched, her eyes scanning the opposite ridge. She saw them then, 3 men on horseback, laughing as they fired wantonly into the trees. They were drunk on power and cruelty. She saw Cassian, a dark shape moving parallel to them, flanking them. He was outnumbered. Anwe's eyes darted around their camp. Her gaze fell on the tinder box and a small, sealed tin of oil Cassian used for cleaning his guns. An idea, desperate and dangerous, took root. She remembered Cassian's lesson about the wind. It was blowing steadily from their camp toward the ridge the raiders occupied. Working quickly, her hands no longer trembling, she gathered a pile of the driest pine needles and moss she could find. She soaked a rag in the oil, placed it in the center of the pile, and with a flick of flint and steel sparked a flame. At first it was just a tiny flicker. She shielded it, nurturing it, blowing on it gently until it caught. The oil-soaked rag ignited with a whoosh, and the dry tinder exploded into a thick, acrid black smoke. The wind caught it immediately, carrying the dense cloud directly towards the raiders. It was a signal of a much larger fire, a tactic of confusion. The men on the ridge stopped, their laughter dying. "What the hell is that?" one of them shouted. Their horses grew skittish, tossing their heads at the unfamiliar, choking smell. The distraction was all Cassian needed. A single clean shot from his rifle echoed, and one of the raiders tumbled from his saddle. The other 2, panicked and blinded by the smoke, fired wildly before turning their horses and fleeing back the way they came. Silence descended again, thick with the smell of smoke and gunpowder. Cassian emerged from the trees, his face grim. He looked at the body on the ridge, then at the smoking pile of tinder, and finally at Anwe. He walked over to her, his long strides eating up the distance. He knelt in front of her, taking her smoke-stained face in his hands. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, and in his eyes she saw it all. Awe, relief, and a fierce, burning pride. He pulled her into a rough embrace, his arms a circle of strength around her. She was no longer a victim he was protecting. She was a partner who had fought alongside him. The raider attack solidified their bond, forging it from a fragile alliance into an unbreakable partnership. The body was dealt with in the grim, practical way of the wilderness, and life in their small camp resumed, but with a fundamental shift. Anwe was no longer a patient, but an equal. She walked with a limp, and her ankle would likely never be the same, but she moved with a new confidence. Cassian taught her more of the mountain's secrets, not as a teacher to a student, but as one professional sharing tradecraft with another. She learned to read the weather in the clouds, to find water, to move without a sound. Her hands became even more capable, her senses sharper. The memory of the gilded cage grew more distant, a story from another woman's life. One afternoon, weeks later, a lone rider approached their camp. It was not a raider or a hunter. He was a post rider, one of the tough, grizzled men who navigated the territories carrying mail. Cassian met him at the edge of the clearing, his hand resting near his pistol. The rider, a man named Jeb, was known to Cassian. He dismounted, eyeing Anwe with open curiosity. "Cassian, heard you were still up here," Jeb said, handing him a small pouch. "Got a letter for you. Came all the way from the city. And this." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. It was a bounty notice. Anwe's blood ran cold. It featured a crude but recognizable sketch of her. The name was wrong, unnamed Chinese woman, but the description of her dress was accurate. Alistair Finch was offering a handsome reward for her return. "Been posted in every town from here to the territories," Jeb said, spitting. "Rich man's lost property. Seems she ran off on him." He looked from the poster to Anway. "Looks like his property found a new owner." The words, meant as a coarse joke, struck Anway like a physical blow. Property. Owner. Cassian's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. "She ain't property," he growled, his voice dangerously low, "and I ain't her owner. Now get." Jeb, seeing the look in Cassian's eyes, wisely decided to leave. He mounted his horse and rode away without another word. The silence he left behind was heavy with the intrusion of the world they had escaped. Anway stared at the bounty notice, at the crude drawing of her face. The past had reached for her. But as Cassian took the paper from her trembling hand and crumpled it into a ball before tossing it into the fire, she felt a surge of defiance. She was not that woman anymore. He then handed her the letter. It was from her uncle. His familiar spidery handwriting seemed alien in this wild place. With trembling fingers she broke the wax seal. The letter was a pathetic plea, full of self-pity and fear of Alistair's wrath, begging her to return and accept her fate for the good of the family. He promised Alistair would be merciful. A lie. She read it once, then twice. She looked up at Cassian, who stood watching her, his expression unwavering. He was giving her the choice. This was her boundary to draw. Without a word, she folded the letter, walked to the fire, and dropped it in. She watched the paper blacken and curl into ash, the words of her old life turning to smoke. When she turned back to Cassian, her eyes were clear. "This is my home now," she said, her voice steady. He nodded once, a slow, solemn gesture of acceptance. He pulled her to him, and as he held her, she knew she was finally, truly free. Not because she had escaped, but because she had chosen where she belonged. The threat of Alistair still lingered on the horizon, a storm yet to break. But for now, in the heart of the mountains, she was sovereign.